I was going to wear my lipstick today. And I forgot.
Ah, I actually thought about that before we started. I was like, I wonder if I could persuade Steph to wear a lipstick to the live, but maybe
I was
save that
getting
for the live.
ready and I was going to put it on. And then I looked at my clock and it was 9 and I was like, shoot, I got to go. And I left and now I just remembered. Oh, well, I'll do it
Oh
next time.
well. Did you know that?
I loved that lipstick.
Oh, you did. Guys, you should have seen Steph trying the lipstick on in the Mac store. It's like, the kids that just really don't want to get new shoes or something like that, and they're having their feet measured and they don't want to be there. They want to just like be in
Yeah.
the playground or something.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
kind of
I
like
felt like a
Steph.
clown.
Yeah.
I
And
felt like an imposter.
the look she was giving me when I was trying to take photos for social media. It's like
You missed it. You missed it because
it's
it's
like
not going up again.
people were invested. People were invested in this
Mm.
stuff. So I felt like we owed it.
Yeah. All right. I'll wear it next
On another note,
time. Mm.
I I genuinely think about the toilet paper in your house at least twice a week.
What? What toilet?
At
Why?
least twice a week. Because the
That's
toilet
great.
paper you have in your house, it's like wiping your tushy with a soft scarf. I mean,
It's Charmin.
no, we have Charmin here. It is American Charmin. It is
Ah,
different. I even went and bought quilted, especially for when you came, and it was nothing close. And I knew it wouldn't be because I've
I
seen the
didn't even think
quilted here in
about
the
it.
UK before. Um, I thought, I wonder if she's looking at my nasty
Not a bit.
quilted.
I don't notice details like that.
I
Um,
only did because it was so out there, and I noticed it when I was in New York as well. And it kind of feeds into the stereotype of America of being like one way or the other way. So you have this toilet paper, which is like, I don't know, it's like cloth. And then you have the other toilet paper is so thin that you need so much of it.
yeah.
And there doesn't seem to be much in the middle. And I
Are
feel
you
like
saying
most of
that
us,
we're black and white?
I think you're quite extreme.
Are you saying that we're all or nothing?
What the hell? Let's just get on let's just get on with
We're
the episode.
segueing.
Yeah, we are segueing into gosh, it's got so many names, hasn't
Yeah.
it? What the hell
What the
effect?
hell? Yeah.
Um,
Abstinence violation effect.
hitting the F it button.
Yep. What are we talking about? We're talking about that moment. It is a moment, right? Like where you're like,
It's a switch.
yeah, like F this. I'm already here. Might as well just push on, keep going
Yes.
in the middle of an eating episode, typically.
Yes. And to me, it feels very rebellious as well.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
ties in with perfectionism. It's like if I can't do this, if it's not going to look like this, then it might as well look terrible, you know?
Maybe be helpful to talk about all the ways it does show up like that. Like perfectionism is one, or I'm sorry, perfectionism and rebellion. I mean, those are actually two different things. But how the script in your mind might sound a little different and the motivation for it might sound a little different or be different depending on what part of you is reacting, whether it is the perfectionistic part or the rebel part. I would argue too that there's an injustice part for me
Hmm.
that comes up, kind of this like it's not fair, which I can speak to because it doesn't sound related exactly. It might be a little bit of a stretch, but that's how would have experienced it. I'd also be curious to know if you ever feel that way now.
Mm. Well, I think firstly, in terms of where it shows up, I think Last Supper eating is a classic example of the what the hell effect. You have an idea about how you're going to eat, you're going to stick to these rules or these parameters, and then when you break it, it's like, what the hell? Like, I'll make up for it tomorrow. For me, it's a very much a now doesn't count, and future me will figure it out. Like future me will balance I was going to say scales, which kind of works on a couple of levels, really. I can see what you mean when you say that it's not fair.
Mm.
But I think the word rebellion, it's almost like a proof of freedom and autonomy and
Yeah.
frustration as well in there
Yes.
sometimes.
Yes. I think part of that is because when you've got a plan or even an intention of just being moderate or regulated or balanced in some way, of being normal with your food, quote unquote. And then you get to the food and it's like something happens to you where it's like you're not even necessarily choosing it. It just, this is why I felt like it was an injustice because I felt like I have the best of intentions. I am not trying to binge or overeat, but it's happening to me. Like, I don't feel like I have a choice. And that would piss me off because it would be like, ugh, why can't I just be normal? What is this force that's coming over me that's compelling me to keep eating? And I don't feel like I can stop. And that feels really unfair. And then it's like, well, fine. Like, oh, I get, yes, it is rebellious because it's like, oh, okay, well, watch me, watch how deep I can go. And then tomorrow I will punish myself. This was my binge restrict personality coming out. But it wasn't even always punishment. It was kind of almost like I will restrict just as hard as I binge right now. Like I'm not going to get away. Like this binge force isn't going to win. I will make up for this tomorrow. But right now, watch me like kind of give you the middle finger. Whoever you is, the force, this kind of injustice that I perceived.
Well, there's the biological element, right? There's your
Yeah.
biology that's driving, it feels so powerful. Then there's a psychological experience of it as well. I've definitely experienced the biology and the psychology together. And I think I've experienced the psychology kind of on its own. I'm not saying that the biology is not there at all, body mind connection and
Yeah.
all of that. But you know, where it's not come from an extreme hunger place,
Right.
but there's still like the scarcity part is being
Yeah.
triggered in my brain.
Yeah. But also that feels sometimes not like you. It also I've experienced that too, and it still feels like this thing beyond me.
Oh, it feels
Perhaps it
like
is.
me.
It's subconscious. Oh, it does?
It
It doesn't
does.
feel like me. It
It,
feels
it
like this.
No, no, no. It feels like everything else I'm trying to do that's not this in the moment, I mean, is me trying to protect myself from the reality that this is actually me.
Huh. Oh, I
So
feel the
it's
opposite.
almost like, well, of course you were going to blow it. Like, of course, like this
Yeah.
is actually who you are. And all the stuff when you're trying to get it right, that's not you. What on earth made you think that could be you? This is you, this out of control version
Mm,
who's just falling apart at the seams. This is who you really are. Like that's how it speaks to me in the moment.
yeah.
I'm not saying I believe that it is who I am, you
Yeah.
know, in
Yeah.
my higher self, but it feels like it's me. And that's interesting that your experience is almost, it feels like it's something that,
This oppressor.
yeah.
Yeah. I think that probably speaks to our different psychologies
Yes. And
and like
hopefully,
ways of growing up.
yeah, and hopefully catches our whole audience in there, whether you relate more to
Yeah.
Steph or
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
relate more to me.
We got it. Yes. We're capturing you somewhere.
That's the way it works.
This phenomenon, I think about a lot. It comes up a lot in questions from followers and viewers and listeners. And I sometimes think now about this is why I asked you if it occurs for you now. Like, why doesn't this occur for me anymore? And when I have a flavor of it, because I do, I'll get a whiff of it sometime, like holidays, like things like that. How come it doesn't turn into a Last Supper? Why is that not happening anymore? Is it too early to go into that part?
No, well, maybe we can wrap this episode up in 10 minutes. Like, there's no point dragging it out for 40 minutes just for the sake of it. If we got this covered, we've got it covered. I doubt we will, but you never know.
Well, I think first of all, for people just to hear us talking about it, sometimes, just the relatability of like, oh, other people feel like that too. And
Mhm.
oh, there's a name for this thing. Like this is a phenomenon that has been named in 5 different ways. Like, oh, okay, that's helpful because it means that it's happening to other people. I'm not alone.
I,
And I think it's also, oh, go
I
ahead.
don't know, you do, and
And I think it's also hopeful that I hope it's helpful to hear us talk about it because that used to happen to me constantly. I mean, like, I lived like that. And it's not happening to me anymore. And I think that's a hopeful thing because I don't, it's not necessarily a reflection of something that is beyond your control or that's something that can't shift.
yes. And I guess the main reasons why, when you asked, like, does this happen now? Not with food. And then I was trying to think if it happened in other areas of my life, anywhere that felt close to what it was like with food. And I can't find it. And maybe before the end of this episode, you might say something, or I might think of something and I'll go, actually, that's it over there.
Mm.
But I don't think so in the same way. And I think the reason is there's, first of all, the reality of not trying to control food in the same way. So there's less to rebel against. But I
Right.
became much less conflicted in myself. So that conflict with myself, with different parts of myself, would just play out with food constantly. That was the place where it played out with the most energy. But then through like having a better relationship between the parts of myself, that bleeds into everything.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think the last time I really kind of got at war with myself over something. And
You're just too perfect now.
well, it's not to say that I never had the moments where it would show up more like a big frustrated huff and like
Mm.
a, oh, I don't want to do this then. You know, it would
Yeah.
be kind of
Yeah.
like it would
Yeah.
feel, for those of you who can't see me on YouTube, it's my body
Just throwing
language.
her hands up.
I'm just throwing my arms up. What it is have you ever seen that reel of that kid? And it's really little kid, like 18 months old or something like that. And she's got like a cup with a lid on, and there's a little hole in the lid to put the straw in. She's trying to get the straw in the lid. She's trying to do it. She's trying to do it. And she can't do it. She keeps missing it. You know, they don't have any coordination at that age.
Yeah.
And then she just throws it down and this big huff of like, and it's like, well, if I can't get the straw in, fine, I won't have a drink.
Yes.
And that
Actually.
is still relatable, but like in little flashes that would pass like
Yes.
that. Like she's going to be fine
Correct.
in 10 minutes. So I
Right.
would have a moment of like,
That's what I
there's no point
mean.
in anything. And then it's gone.
That's what I mean. That's how I experience it now. And as you're telling me that, I haven't seen that reel, but I'm like, oh wait, I do this way more than I thought. Because like there are times I do it in front of my kids, which is such bad role modeling where sometimes I'm just getting so frustrated that something won't work for me. Like I'm trying to carry 17 things up the steps and one of them falls. And I'm like, fine, stay there. I'm not playing this game with you, like talking to the inanimate object, you know, because it's just it's this oppressor. Um, but it doesn't have the same consequences that food would have. And I think that that's part of it, right? It's kind of like if I leave the frustration, if I throw the cup, no one gets hurt. You know what I mean? And I don't have to pay for that later unless like I spill it. But you know, there's something different about when it's food. But I still have flashes of that feeling. When you're talking about being less conflicted with yourself, I agree. And I think that's a lot of the reason why, aside from the very obvious reason, by the way, that when you're not restricting, when I'm not restricting anymore, this drastically decreases this push pull. But even absent of that, the frustration element comes from a part of me that can still get very dysregulated. I just think I know how to regulate faster also, right? Like my regulation skills are are present now, whereas they weren't before. I would dive really headfirst into the victimhood of, oh, like this thing that's coming that to take me over, or the fact that I can't is some kind of confrontation somewhere, and that I could not regulate out of that. So having some kind of internal sense of regulation does come more on board. So I mean, I'm relating it back to dysregulation and regulation as well, but I still experience, and there will be times where I have like a flash of that, even with like it'll happen on I think it's just habit though. Like on a holiday, especially, I'll feel like when I'm just kind of like, there's 17 different kind of cookies I want to try, and I'm like, I'm just trying them. And there's a moment where I'm like, you know, that sort of thought comes up. Maybe it's worth talking about what I'm doing with that now. But it's not taking me over. And I think that's important to say because I don't think it has to look perfect, right? Like it's okay if you have a thought or if even the invitation to what the hell comes up. I don't think that that's like, okay, well now I've failed. I have to follow the urge. It actually can show up and you can regulate through it.
Yes. And I think also to tie this in, because are we saying this is the same as the abstinence violation effect? And I guess first of all, we need to just touch and explain on what that is, just in case somebody hasn't heard of it. So it's
Yeah.
language that's often used in the addiction world. And it's the idea of when you have been abstaining from something for a while. Let's use alcohol as an example, pull it away from food. You abstain, you abstain, you abstain. And then if you lose your abstinence, you're going to go even crazier with that, whatever that was, because you've had this longer period of abstinence. It's almost like this buildup of the what the hell effect. And the challenge, I guess, where that comes with food is that there are people out there talking about compulsive eating, as in we need to abstain from compulsive eating. And that looks like whatever they're saying, either looks like planning every bite you eat or not eating any sugar or flour or whatever it might be. And so the challenge, the hardcore addiction model would say, you just don't violate your abstinence. So surely that's the answer, Stephanie.
There you go. So straightforward.
Yeah, just yeah.
Until it isn't. It's the perceived violation is another word for violation. There would be failure, right? So it's the feeling of I've failed to abstain. I have violated myself or my program or my values in this way, which speaks really to, I think, why restriction is. I think there's a link there with restriction. There's subtler forms of that too. I mean, it could show up in that addiction mentality or like no sugar, white flour. And then the second you violate that abstinence, you're like, might as well. But it can also be just periods of time where you haven't binged, and it's not based in restriction, but it can feel like you've somehow violated something by eating out of regulation. Like just like I've been really intuitive with my food. I haven't been restricting. I've been listening to hunger and fullness. That's felt relatively easy. And in this moment it doesn't. I feel like I'm violating something, or I feel like something's compromised here. So it doesn't have to necessarily be like a rule. It could just be a sense of feeling in control in some way. And I'm not using control there to imply the kind that's sticky. But I think what it's doing is I think, try as we might, our brains really like categorization, and it likes black and white. It's much easier for the brain to work that way. It's more efficient to like be like, this is this, this is this. This is good, this is bad. And I think living in a gray area, working on being able to not be so black and white is a pretty consistent energy. You know what I mean? And I think it can get easier, but I think it runs counter to our instincts as humans, especially in times of stress. So where there is a sense of like, I've been doing this thing, or I've been eating in this way for a period of time, and now there's a change, or there's something here that's like not that, there's right there, I think there is a natural invitation to notice it, and then to be like, this isn't that. Does that mean that is bad and this is, or that is good and this is bad? Like there's almost like that's just an automatic almost categorization the brain is making. And we have to sort of reroute that to be like, wait a minute, like, no, that's not a failure. But it takes energy to come up with that gray area, because in a moment like that, it's just kind of like a quick neural pathway of like good and bad.
Yeah. And I think the word failure in there is actually a key piece of this. Is that the feeling, the feeling of like, I've blown it. And there's a moment in that where I think sometimes, certainly for me, it's like it wants to show up as like a punishment. Well, then you don't even get like any of the good stuff. That it can feel like I want to kick myself. So like, this is how I'm going to do it.
That's interesting though, because when I think about wanting to kick myself or like some kind of punishing, it doesn't go towards restriction though. So it's interesting. Like, I've never had, and I can identify with restrictions. So like, I've never had a moment though where I've blown it, quote unquote, and been like, as punishment for that, you restrict now. Well, it is tomorrow, but in that moment, it never is. So I think it's not just about punishment. I think it's about, because if it was, I feel like I would have had a moment of like, okay, now you get nothing. And that never happens. It's like once you get on the ride, you can't get off. I think there's some kind of, maybe we tell ourselves it's a punishment, but it's kind of like not, because it's like, I just can't help it. Like, I just don't, I have no control, and I'm just, okay, here's how I'm making sense of it. Again, as a binge restrictor, may not apply to everybody, but I feel like once I started perceiving myself to be failing, I perceived myself to be out of control. And there's some part of me that understood I didn't have control. And so I made myself feel better about that by saying, tomorrow I'll have control, because in the future I can do that. But I knew in the moment I couldn't. Like, there was no stopping myself once I started. So it was kind of conceding, okay, fine, I'm out of control. And that's very uncomfortable for me. But tomorrow I'm going to be so in control. Like, it helped me feel better, I think, in that moment, because there wasn't a way for me to actually control it right then.
Well, there's a plan to make up for it the next day,
to get the control back.
Yeah. And maybe yours felt like, you don't deserve to eat anything the next day or something like that. I don't know if it sounded more like that. I know that's more of a restrictive voice, whereas mine would be more like, you'll make up for it. Like, so you'll balance this out tomorrow. And it would be much more like, hey, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it today. Like, today's a write-off. Like that clean slate thinking, which is where this would kind of veer into perfectionism as well. The appeal of the clean slate and being like, oh, you are not going to believe what tomorrow me is going to be like. You wait
she's
till
got
you
it.
meet her.
Got it going on. She's so smart.
I can't wait to be her. Can't wait to force
That's
myself
what
to
it
be
is.
her.
It just makes you feel so much better knowing that future you is so much better than present you. But that is what it feels like. It's like
Yeah.
tomorrow I'll have it,
Mm.
but today I just don't. And there's some like as if that makes some sense.
Yeah. And I've spoken before how I started calling myself out on that. And again, like this is not helpful in a restrictor mindset, but I would say to myself at times when I was on the verge of just going like, "Oh, I'm just going to go and binge because tomorrow I'll do this instead. Of saying to myself, what makes you believe you'll be able to do tomorrow what you're struggling to do today? And I couldn't come back from that question. And again, like, I'm not talking about this from like the restrictor place, apart from the just
Mm.
general everyday restriction of somebody who's grown up in diet culture world. But yeah, it called me out and it made me pause because I couldn't kid myself. And we might have spoken about this on the self-deception episode. I couldn't kid myself when I asked that question that tomorrow was going to be different. So then, don't get me wrong, sometimes I'd still go, well, I don't care. There was still an effort and I'm just going to go ahead and binge anyway. And that was even worse because I didn't even have the reassurance in me
Yeah.
that tomorrow I was going to get a handle on it. I didn't know how long it was going to go until it released me. And it often felt like it released me rather than I managed to start controlling.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about how I've experienced this phenomenon from a restrictive place and a non-restrictive, like or a lesser restrictive place. Um, because the restrictive kind, I didn't have control. Like, and that was part of the humility that I eventually had to get to of understanding that like my body was calling the shots. And this whole even calling it the effort mentality was almost like this cop out. Like it was kind of like, well, this is effort mentality. It's not like it's some kind of psychological issue I might be able to overcome. It wasn't. I think a lot of times what this phenomenon was hunger and just rebel restriction that was very biological and physiological. And until I could really surrender to that and say, like, this is something that until I stop restricting, this is going to keep happening. My body's going to do this force that will come. I had to know that and really believe that was bigger than me. That was stronger than me. For number one, that's the first thing I had to do. So I think even naming it, effort mentality, can sometimes be a cop out to saying like, oh yeah, it's just a psychological phenomenon that once I get a handle on it, I'll figure it out. When no, it's restricting and it's the rebel response of that. But I have also experienced this phenomenon not so much in a heavy state of restriction. And in that place, because there's just a little more regulation available because your body's not just acting out of urgent hunger, I I think there's room here for talking to yourself a little bit and for questioning yourself and to saying things like you're saying of what makes me think tomorrow will be different. It also leaves room to slow down and say, am I in black and white thinking? That question was very powerful to me once my restriction calmed down. I was able to actually name this is black and white thinking. And once I could name that, it gave it a different, it just gave me a different perspective on it because it kind of showed me what was happening in my brain. And I was like, okay, I can work with that. I know that's something I'm trying to work on. How would that show up? How would that make sense here? Not to say that it would work, quote unquote, every time, but it still invited a conversation unavailable to me if it's a restriction based Last Supper kind of eating. I think the distinction, I know our listeners here probably are like pretty well divided on restrictive and not, lesser restrictive. And so the distinction matters. But I think that once you calm down the urgent part, like that's where these kind of we can have a little more influence on what's going on here. And I would offer naming, questioning, having these conversations inside is part of the beginning of that, even if your behavior is not changing right away.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that becomes with being really honest with ourselves, right? Because I didn't want to admit that there was any restriction whatsoever in my experience. And so I resisted that idea for a long time because I felt like I was never good at it. And, you and I have touched on this before. We'll often work with people who are adamant they're not restricting. And we do a 24-hour recall and they are.
Yes.
Like, as objectively as we can look at this, like, they are. But it seems like you always knew you were restricting. Were there ever times when you were, oh no, maybe not, maybe like in your orthorexic. I tell you what, I won't tell you what your experience was. Why don't you tell me what your experience was?
In what?
In terms of, were there times when looking back, you're like, I was definitely restricting, but at that time I would have been adamant that I wasn't?
Yes. Because in my mind, the definition of restricting was low calorie or being thin.
Hmm.
So I would have thought I was doing the right thing. Yes, I had to completely change my definition of what restriction was. I also thought, like with orthorexia, that I was also doing the right thing. Like it was, I couldn't have understood it as restriction. And I was binging a lot. So, I mean, I put up a post years ago that said something like, you can binge every day and still be restricting. Because essentially that's kind of what was happening. But I think that's a misconception. That's a way that we're fooled into thinking, but I'm not restricting. And that's what I hear from clients a lot. Like, I'm not restricting. Like, I'm binging. You don't understand. My problem is binging. I'm like, I know, between the binges, you're restricting, and that's it counts. Your body reads that. Even if calorically you're getting enough or more than enough. If you're having these hours or these gaps of time where you're making up for that binge yesterday, it's still setting up the binge. Again, there's the mental restriction part is very, 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 it's equal
Hmm.
in for many of us. It's equally restrictive.
I mean, for some people, this could keep showing up almost the minute they eat. If they're really trying to, let's say they're trying to do intermittent fasting or something like that, the minute you eat something and that you think you shouldn't eat, what's the reaction? And for not everybody is going to be like an abstinence violation effect, but it's interesting, I think, to start understanding our reactions when we eat something that we're telling ourselves we don't think we need or we should be eating or whatever it is. What's the reaction that happens? And a big part for me, because originally we were going to record an episode on self-trust today, and that's going to be coming up soon. But originally, when I was thinking about the self-trust piece, the first place I learned to trust myself is trusting that whatever behavior I do, whatever I eat, even whether I binge or not, that how I react to it, that's the bit where I started trusting that my reactions would be more, I say supportive, that sounds quite soft, but just closer to what I would actually need because I saw how my reaction to not even just binging, my reaction to eating something I think I shouldn't eat was a big part of the problem itself. Instead, I was just thinking, well, I should just not eat the things that I think I shouldn't eat. And actually, no, I need to learn how to change the way I react
Yeah,
when I
right.
eat the things I think I shouldn't eat. And that
Yeah.
feels like it's all part of this pattern.
Yeah. Or even it's not always just what you're eating, but like how much you've eaten. So overeating a bit, right? So we talk a lot in the extremes of it, I think, to make points. And also because I personally dealt with extremes of it. It doesn't even have to be like, oh, I'm not allowed to eat uh, white flour and sugar, and I've done that. I've eaten the cookie, and here goes. It doesn't even have to be that extreme. It can sometimes just be a little bit of over fullness, just a little, just more than you usually have, or more than you wanted, and that is so uncomfortable. And the reaction to just even something that subtle could be a whole story. And I think we're talking about stories here. Like, what are the stories that come up when we experience the abstinence violation effect? In whatever way, even if it's just like, oh, I'm just a little more full than I wanted to be. That makes me really like, I'm just even trying to, and I can easily kind of go to that place of how uncomfortable it can feel, or to sit with, what is this? It's like sitting with something that's uncomfortable. It's just like, oh, how do I just be okay with that? It's like the instinct to make it really bad, to make myself really full instead, is somehow easier, right? Like, and what is that? It's like I'd rather violate so fiercely that I'm like so full than sit with a mild amount of fullness. Like that one I have to think about like why it's more appealing. And I think that goes back to that it's easier to categorize distinct things. Like it's kind of like if I mess up, I'm going to mess up big, because then tomorrow there's no question that I messed up. There will be no room for negotiating that. It'll be like, no, no, no. Yesterday, you have to pay for that today. Like there's no question about that. If it's a mild violation, tomorrow I might think, is it really that bad? Like, do we really have to make up for that? And then I might let myself get away with it. I think that for me was part of why it was easier to make a mistake, a huge mistake, rather than just a small one.
Along those lines, I think there was something in my experience about this pull to extremes. So to overeat a bit and kind of, feel that sort of the agitation and the uncomfortableness of that was harder to know what to do with than to just go all out so that I could just like wallow in a shame pit afterwards. And then I'd get this real boost of motivation that might come, maybe only for like half an hour before I went to bed. It wasn't even there in the morning, and it rarely amounted to anything. It just fizzled out. But there was something about this sort of cycle, and almost it's actually making me think of dopamine nation and like the pain pleasure balance.
Yeah.
And it's almost like the seesaw is just like it's
It doesn't know what to
destabilized. So I
do.
just need to slam down on the
Yeah.
pain
Yeah.
side, and then my
Yeah.
brain is going to try to like pull
Yep.
me the other way again, and then
Yeah.
somehow like I'll get it.
Correct.
It's hard to
Yeah, there's like a
articulate.
natural, yeah, there must be something neurochemical in that because it's so compelling. It's really feels true. The other
Hmm.
thing that feels true is that I'm like thinking, I don't know why holidays come. I guess that would be where it would happen a lot. And I would remember I would eat I would cross the line. I would like cross the line. And I used to have calorie thresholds. So I would cross the calorie threshold by just a bit. And then I was like, ugh. And then it was like, I would rather blow through the calorie threshold because and then I remember there were times where I tried and I thought I was being like, I thought I was, well, maybe I was trying to be gray area. And I was like, okay, you've only just blown it a little bit. Like there's no reason to make it huge. But in doing that, you're sort of setting yourself up. You're actually kind of restricting, like, because it would be like, now stay
Hmm.
here. You all of a sudden have this line of like, don't do any more. And just that sense of like, I've gone as far as I can go. I'm not allowed to go anymore, even though I'm being flexible about allowing this little bit of extra. It's kind of like, but that's it. But that's it. All of a sudden, that takes a lot more energy and I think creates more another rebel response of like, I can't hold out the rest of the day like towing the line now. That sense became bigger. So it was, I think the energy it takes again to stay in that gray area, both actually and also because now we're having stories about like really now you got to watch yourself is too much. And then it's like, well, it's just easier for me. I don't want to think about this anymore. Like I don't want to toe the line anymore. I don't want to like be good the rest of the day. So like forget it.
Gosh, there's so much to this. As I'm thinking about this and remembering, a big part sometimes, because it had different flavors at different times. One of the flavors was despair. And so it would be this whole, I let myself think I could do it differently. Like I let myself think that this time was going to be different, and I've blown it in some way. What's the point? It wasn't even an angry, what's the point? It was like a defeated, like, what's the point in even
Mm-hmm.
trying? Like this, like what's the point? It was so defeated. So a lot of the time it was like almost like this collapse into something. I'm like, it's too hard to try anymore. And I'm just gonna not try. I'm just gonna
Yeah.
not try. And I don't want to think. So I'm just gonna
Yeah.
keep eating because I don't want to think
Right.
about that or feel about that.
I almost think that how do you get through this? So anyone listening who's like, yeah, I relate to all of that. This is all very much still happening for me. I almost think like thinking about it as in, okay, regulate and, gray area and empower, like it's not helpful. Maybe to some people it is, if you've got a lot of energy to it for it. But the way that this whole dynamic shifted for me wasn't that I actually, and you, I think might be different for you, but I didn't start coping with that moment differently necessarily at first. I think I started setting myself up to not have those moments so often. And that came from an overarching approach that wasn't about the moment like that. It wasn't about that moment. It was about how do I create a life with food that where I'm not being pushed up against this scenario, where like this scenario is just not happening so much for me because I don't have enough energy to constantly feel defeated like that. And to like, when the defeat idea would come up, yeah, you're like, whatever. You just give up on yourself. It's extremely disempowering.
Mhm.
Um, and then you
And
don't have the energy. You don't even have the will.
but it feels like it's me doing it as well. There are other times when the binge felt there was a lot of energy and it felt very powerful and like it was happening to me. But in the moments when I just felt like I'd blown it and then fell into defeat, that felt like that was me. So it felt like there was there's no primal excuse for that. That was me just being useless and broken and do you know what I mean? All of those
Yeah.
things. And that's where I think did not realize how much was going to be in this till we started talking about it. Like all these different places that this experience can come from. And then I guess there's something about understanding that piece. And always we have to deal with primal first, because till we
Yeah.
regulate the primal, we're not going to be able to
Yeah. Right.
even get to the other places. Everyone wants to do, not everyone, that was really like, often I think people want to do it all at once. I know
Yeah.
I would have wanted to. I'd be like, okay, so I need to address all these different things. I'm going to do it all at once.
Correct. And I think that, I mean, my whole philosophy is like, we have to address layer one first and then layer two. So that's kind of how I went about it. It was like, I'm not going to worry about my self-compassion, my stories, my black and white thinking. Like that's layer two. I'll get there. First, I have to address my restriction. That was that I had, and that's it. That's as much as I can handle at first. Address that. And then it became like a more matter of like, okay, humility. I mean, what episode is that? So early. Such a
Yeah,
good episode.
it is such a good episode.
um there's some kind of humility around like, okay, I maybe I don't have, yeah, maybe this is going to happen, maybe there's going to be times where this does happen. How can I don't know that I ever thought about it. I don't know that I ever like was like, okay, I'm going to deal with my what the hell mentality now. Like it wasn't a thing like that. But I think what I was addressing the larger concepts of self-compassion, fierce and gentle, gray area thinking, the storytelling. There's something about like an openness, because for a long time I think like when trigger would happen, my response would happen, and it was like this domino effect. And part of recovery was like, what if trigger happens, instinct to react happens, and then I take it, what if I think about that differently, even just thinking about it differently, rather than like going immediately to, this is the place where now I do this, and then I go to my room and I go in my bed and I wallow. Like that's just the behavior that follows. And it's kind of like, what if I don't? What if I binge and then stay present with my family on this holiday? You know what I mean? Like just things about changing the reactions, essentially going back to that, and being open to like, maybe that would be helpful. Because in my mind prior, it was like, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Once I failed, I failed. That's the end of the story. And then what I do after that doesn't even matter, because the most important thing is that I failed. I started to shift it to be like, what if that's not the most important part? What if the most important part is my reaction for the next 12 hours or 24 hours? Like that, I actually feel like I have a little more control over that or influence on that, because it's not happening in that like acute reaction of dysregulation. Like it's me showing up a little bit more for myself afterwards. I think without naming it like this, without ever thinking about it like this, that's kind of what started to happen. Is I started to question my responses over the next day, um, or even that night or whatever, even by eating breakfast the next day, and just being like, well, that's new, and I don't want to do that. That's so counterintuitive to me. But like, what if I did that? And those, what if I did this? What if I did that? What if I tried this? I started to be more open to that. Whereas I think before, and that was, there's a humility in that, and there's a surrender in that. But before it was like, no, no, this is just what I failed. That's it. This is how we go now. Oh, I was so stubborn.
Yeah, and it kind of loops around with exactly what I shared as well about changing my reactions is kind of where it began before changing behavior. But from the control or restriction element, the challenge for me was around letting go of that. So when you mentioned eating breakfast, like I was reminding of really consciously deciding, right, tomorrow I need to make sure that I eat plenty tomorrow. And then I make sure that my meals are substantial meals, so that that was in no way a day that I think that if I ate like that every day, I would lose weight. Because that was a
Right.
sneaky thing as well, because it was always like, I'm not trying to restrict here. Like, I don't want to do
Yeah.
anything silly. I just want to eat pretty healthily in a way that over time, I just start to release some weight in a very healthy way. Like, how on earth can that be a problem?
Right.
And it turned out that there's something in the psychology or the biology or whatever of that for me that my experience kept showing me this is a problem. And that felt really hard from a humility perspective, because it looked like quite a basic thing here. I wasn't shooting for the moon here. I felt like my
Right.
expectations were very, very reasonable.
Yeah.
So it was, and then I think a little bit hard to fully relate to a lot of the eating disorder rhetoric that I was
Yep.
hearing at the time.
Mm. It's tricky to even talk about that because it can almost sound like, well, if you have that thought, then what are you doomed? Like if that, because what if that thought just shows up? I think it's about the way we're relating to that thought or how much we're even aware of it. Because there's an argument to be made of, okay, well, if you have a binge one night, if this happens, does that mean you have to then go and overstuff yourself the next day just so that you're not restricting? You know what I mean? What if I'm actually not hungry? And like, what if it does make sense for me to eat fresh food the next day? Like, does the thought preclude that from being helpful? And it can,
Yeah,
you
and
know,
often it was very much as well about ensuring that my meals had, a good variety of foods in, that I was including fibrous foods. And actually, I didn't always eat it all, but I was genuinely like planning it in and giving myself plenty of permission to. So there would be some days where I'd be like, okay, right, I'm going to have this filling breakfast and I'm going to have this for lunch, I'm going to have this for dinner. And maybe I didn't feel quite so hungry when it came to it, and I might have a bit less.
yeah,
But it was really there. There was something about, I felt like I needed to reassure the part of my brain that was freaking out about scarcity or threat of scarcity, needed to just be reassured that like food was there,
yes,
food was abundant, that the
yeah,
restriction wasn't coming, like whatever it was that was being triggered off needed that reassurance. And that didn't always involve eating a whole lot more, but just, and it's that phrase, the whole planning to eat more, that can end up meaning you eat less. Not for everybody. And it's also not saying, oh, eating less is good either.
right,
And this
right,
is
right,
why this is sticky to talk about, right? But just that fear is when you've been out of control around food, if you've been compulsively eating or binging for a period of time, why am I deliberately trying to eat more? Because I'm trying to do the opposite, not realizing that
right,
trying to do the opposite is the
right.
very thing that's triggering off so much of the compulsive eating.
Yeah, and it goes back to the attachment
Mm-hmm.
to like how attached are we to the idea of like, oh, I'll just offer myself with food hoping I'll eat less. There's a difference
Oh
between
gosh, yes, 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 yes.
yeah,
Like I've so fallen into that trap as well.
yeah. I think that level of attachment which isn't always within our control either, by the way. Like we can all really not want to be attached to the idea, but be attached to the idea. Again, that's why some of this work is much more broad scope than this moment. Working on not attaching to this is a longer term effort. The other one thing I want to offer is that talking about a lot of this from my favorite frame of reference, which is like this cognitive piece, despair, the disempowerment, the anger, the injustice, all of this creates a sensation in your body. I think that when you're in a moment like that, I've never had a what the F kind of event happen where I didn't feel, like it was never absent of feeling, but I really didn't understand how to cope with that except to plan or to withdraw. Like that cognitive pull to extremes probably kept me from being able to feel disappointment, frustration, anger, all these things that, I mean, even as I'm talking about feeling this oppressor kind of vibe, that's not just about food for me. Like that's feelings that are long, long overdue to be felt. You know what I mean? Like that's deeper stuff that I'm projecting onto food. So I think that the feelings that are coming up in response to anything that we're going through are probably, especially if they're coming up with rigor, are probably feelings that have long been suppressed anyway. So there's an element here of like really being able to or willing sometimes to drop into the body and feel what comes up when this happens. Like what does that feel like? Because that's exactly why the next day would be planned. It would be like I this level of fury I have, I'm gonna, you know what, I'm gonna get rid of it by making up for it. That was my way of dealing with a feeling, was to be like, well, I'll just get rid of that feeling by making, because then I won't feel it tomorrow if I make up for it. Instead, it would have been a lot harder for me to say, oh my God, I have so much feeling, I feel like a victim. Like I feel like I have no control. What does that feel like? And to really kind of be with it instead of to try to, okay, well then tomorrow I'm not gonna feel it. Haha. You know?
And I guess the last thing then that I want to offer is that I think a big piece of this, and I guess my recovery in general, was that the goalpost moved of what I was trying to do with my eating. And it moved to, because I felt so out of control so many times and that was so distressing, there'd be times when maybe I would eat a bit more than I felt comfortable with, but it felt like a choice. And I liked the feeling that what I was eating felt like a choice. And so my goal became much more like I can eat whatever I want. I can eat as much as I want. I just really want it to feel like a choice. And so everything I was doing then became more about that. And so it really helped then with the food or with the eating to be able to make freer choices because I kept just owning them as choices, and learning what made my choices feel more like choices was part of it too. So even in just what I was saying, it's like having a plan to eat these substantial filling meals was a real sense of like, and then I did it. And that's what I chose to do. And I did what I chose to do for myself. And I could feel the reinforcing, rewarding feelings of that. And when I kept coming back to that place, that really helped to kind of keep me due north, if you like, on my recovery path. And I don't think I've ever worded it quite like that
Oh,
before, but it kind
so
of
nice
came to mind
process in this
there.
way.
So
You know
yes,
that there's some kind of universe thing. It's like part of string theory, I think. I couldn't name it, but it's like the observation of a phenomenon can change the outcome of that phenomenon. So even just witnessing something can actually change the
like
outcome.
the observer effect.
The observer effect, yeah.
Uh-huh.
But there's like a whole anyway, there's some part of me thinking like even in just talking about it this way, it's like, okay, like if someone's like, all right, so tomorrow I'm going to offer myself full meals and I'm going to do that. And it's almost could set up an expectation that like, well, that would mean that then I should feel choice and I won't overeat those meals. And just in the expectation of that can actually set up another what the hell effect.
So don't listen to anything
Don't
Steph
listen
and
to
I
us.
say. Find your own way. Yeah. Because these are all things I think that through my exploration, I had this experiential feedback of working for me. And so, and then I think when we share stories and we share this with people, someone can hear it and go like, oh, well, that's what Sarah did, or that's what Steph did. So I'm going to go and do that because that's what they did. This was the result they got. So this should be the result I get. And I guess then
Mm.
my final point now is to maybe emphasize this idea of self exploration and experimentation.
Why'd you giggle?
It just sounded rude.
Really? Rude? Oh. Well, it just sounds like a conundrum. Like it's hard. But yeah, we weren't listening to ourselves as we recovered, so it
Yeah.
was easier to not have an expectation of what was going to
Yeah,
happen.
exactly. Yeah. But yeah.
Anyway,
Anyway, wow. Good
all
chat,
right.
Stephanie.
Yeah, there. Hope it was helpful, everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
All
Well, see
right.
you later.
See you
Bye.
later. Bye bye.
Whew, I'm sweating a little bit.
Because that chat was so
Yeah.
stimulating.